Hello, everyone. This is going to be 8.3 Reconstruction's Impact. And we're going to start with a quote from a later scholar of Reconstruction, the African American historian W.E.B. Du Bois, Harvard educated historian who wrote a book in 1935 called Black Reconstruction in America. And he said the slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again toward slavery. Our objectives: we are going to explain why Reconstruction ended. We're going to evaluate the successes and failures. We're going to describe the experience of African Americans in the changing South and assess how whites created a segregated society in which the South, in the South, and how African Americans responded to this society. So let's look at the end of Reconstruction. Basically, how did this thing that was supposed to keep going and make life better, how did it finish? As the 1860s were finishing up, voters outside of the South, that is, white Northern men, were losing interest in Reconstruction. They were focusing on the fact that there was a corrupt government, there was a bad economy, there was a lot of other stuff going on, and so Americans and, well, humans really have kind of a short attention span. So after a couple years of Reconstruction, voters were like, "What? They haven't fixed that yet?" And so, when white Northerners sort of stopped looking at the South and stopped focusing on Reconstruction, this left many African Americans in the South open to oppression and without any protection. Also, the administration of Ulysses S. Grant was very notoriously corrupt. Grant himself seemed to be the only honest man in his entire administration. And also, the power of the Republican Party was starting to go away. People were tired of this rampant corruption, and so Democrats were gaining a lot more power. However, there were still a few radical Republicans who continued to fight for the rights of African Americans. So we see the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are giving African Americans some constitutional rights. Slavery is abolished. All people who are born in America are citizens regardless of race, and all men have the right to vote. We also see continuations of this in things like the Civil Rights Act of 1875 that guaranteed African Americans the right to public facilities like trains and hotels. The downside of this is that the Supreme Court got to decide how this would be implemented, and that was bad news for African Americans at the time. The Supreme Court heard a series of cases, and in many of these cases voted against African Americans in the South. So, for instance, there was a whole group of cases called the Slaughterhouse cases that said that state governments were the ones who got to decide the rights of their citizens, not the federal government, handing southern states a big stick with which to oppress African Americans. This case also said that civil rights protections did not protect property, for instance. It protected people, not property. In U.S. v. Cruikshank, which looked at the results of a large-scale massacre of African Americans, the Supreme Court said that civil rights laws only protected citizens from the government, not from the people of states. So basically, the state of Mississippi could not lynch you, but the Klan within there could. Meanwhile, we see that a lot of poor white farmers and rich white landowners were working together to take power and influence away from African Americans in the South. Oftentimes, any African American politicians were painted as corrupt. If they continued to advocate, they could be threatened with violence, or violence could actually be acted out upon them. Rich white Democrats became known as redeemers, basically guys who were working to make the South like it was pre-Civil War. And this is another example where you can see it's people who have a certain opinion who are giving this the name. So if these people are called redeemers, it meant that the people who called them that thought that what they were doing was good at the time. So by 1874, the Democrats had basically retaken political power in the South. By 1876, Republicans were losing power both North and South. In 1876, in the presidential election, the Republican candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes, was running against a very popular Democratic governor named Samuel Tilden from New York. In the election, Tilden won the popular vote. Hayes won the electoral vote by a single vote. And both sides were claiming corruption, and both sides were right to claim corruption. It was a very corrupt election. This was basically the closest election we've ever had in the history of the United States, except for maybe Jefferson Burr back in 1800. It was very close, 185 to 184. Democrats protested the fact that Rutherford B. Hayes, or Rutherfraud B. Hayes, as they called him, they said that he was president by corruption and therefore should not be allowed to be president. Some people also worried that this would be the beginning of a whole new civil war, that this could be the tipping point back into war. Eventually, Rutherford B. Hayes got to be president, but he did a backroom deal in order to make sure he got to be president called the Compromise of 1877. In this compromise, Rutherford B. Hayes got to be president. However, he promised to put a Democrat in the cabinet. He also said that southern states were going to be given money to build railroads and other infrastructure projects. And most importantly, and I do mean most importantly of all, the Compromise of 1877 removed Northern troops from the South. And this was basically the end of Reconstruction. When the protection was gone, the military protection was gone, the Southern states and the KKK could do what they wanted. Southern African Americans were on their own. So here's our 19th president, Rutherford B. Hayes, 1877 to 1881. He's from Ohio, where he was a congressman and the governor of Ohio. He is also our first president to ever visit the west coast of America. And he's probably most famous for his wife, the First Lady, Lucy Hayes. Lucy was famous for being a temperance activist. She removed alcohol from the White House. This gave her the not nice nickname of Lemonade Lucy. Now, let's look at this legacy of Reconstruction. Was it a success or was it a failure? Most historians agree it started strong, but it ended up a failure. The changes that were made during the time, including the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments and several of these civil rights bills, these were good. These were enduring, long-lasting, important changes. However, Reconstruction failed to heal these wounds of the Civil War. It failed to bind our country together with race, or to protect African Americans even. So this was another long-term failure of the Reconstruction period. After the Civil War, thanks to Reconstruction, many African Americans did have the right to vote. However, they had the right, but they didn't have the ability sometimes. The Deep South was trying very hard to keep them from voting. Also, very few were able to get enough land together or enough money to own land. So the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were great, and they would help in the long run, especially when we get to the modern civil rights era of the 20th century in the 1950s and 60s. But during that time period of the 1800s, the future looked pretty bleak. Now, one of the other problems that we mentioned a bit last section is the 15th Amendment sort of split the African American rights movement and the women's rights movement, because the 15th Amendment gave voting rights to all men, but women's rights activists were like, well, how come we didn't get the vote? And this caused a breakup, even among women's groups. So there were no longer one large suffrage group. There was a white suffrage group and an African American suffrage group. The African American groups broke off from the white groups to create groups like the Colored Women's Progressive Franchise Association in 1880. So here are some African American suffragists in the early 20th century calling for the women's right to vote. But as you can see, this was a segregated group. Reconstruction also opened up the question of state versus federal power. This, if you recall, was one of the things that helped cause the Civil War in the first place. The federal government had tried, and in the end, they were unable to succeed in maintaining control over state governments in the South. Eventually, they lost control, and the state government sort of got to do whatever they wanted to. This decision would have very long-lasting effects. The South worked very hard to remove power from African American groups during this time at the state level, all the way up through the 1960s and even later. So let's look at how they restricted African American rights. At the end of Reconstruction in 1877, African Americans no longer had the support of the federal government or federal troops in the South. And this had a very tragic, very long-lasting impact for America up through the 20th century. After Reconstruction, the South started to pass laws, laws that limited the rights of African Americans, laws that said you cannot do certain things. They took away voting rights. They enacted what are called Jim Crow laws, which were laws that segregated the South. It made things either white or black only. The Supreme Court continued to rule and say that segregation was allowed as well. So the Supreme Court was hearing cases about this, and they were siding with the segregationists. So here is a Jim Crow drinking fountain from the 20th century. Southern states also found ways around the 15th Amendment to keep African Americans from being able to vote. We see they created what are called poll taxes, where you had to pay money in order to vote. Well, most poor Southern African Americans couldn't afford it. They also had to pass literacy tests. Most African Americans could not read, and so they would fail these literacy tests. Also, these literacy tests were not fair. They were incredibly difficult. They were designed to make people fail. White people, though, didn't have to do poll taxes, didn't have to do literacy tests because they had what was called the grandfather clause, which meant that as long as your ancestors could vote way back in the day before the Civil War, you could vote now. And then, if none of this worked as a last resort, they could resort to violence and intimidation, fraud, corruption, killing people if necessary, harming them, beating them, threatening them. So by the 1940s, only 3% of African Americans in the South could vote, or would vote. And they were a majority in many places. So here is what a poll tax looks like. You can see that you basically have to pay a certain amount of money, $1 in this case, in order to vote. The thing was that back then, many African Americans did not have that $1. Now, segregation. As time was going on, the South became more and more segregated. We see not just the rise of Jim Crow, but almost the Jim Crow triumphant by the end. As schools, trains, water fountains, churches, Bibles, everything was segregated in the South. Now, in the North, there weren't as many segregation laws, but there were some. And also, there were sort of not written laws, but sort of unspoken agreements, what you might call a gentleman's agreement, to keep African Americans out of white-owned establishments. So even in the North, Jim Crow effects were being felt. Now, this is a very important one, so make sure you put a little star next to this or something. In 1896, the Supreme Court passed a Supreme Court case called Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy v. Ferguson was a case about an African-American man who got on board a white-only trolley in Louisiana and was arrested for it. It's almost like a Rosa Parks case, basically. And he knew he was going to get arrested. He hoped that the case would make its way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court would rule that segregation is illegal. Unfortunately for African Americans, the Supreme Court went the other direction, and they said that Jim Crow laws were constitutional as long as the things for the facilities for whites and blacks were separate but equal. And they were separate, that's for sure, but they were not equal. White schools got nearly 4 times the funding. African Americans got the leftovers, basically. And Plessy v. Ferguson would not be overruled until the 1950s with Brown v. Board of Education, and segregation would not end well into the 1960s. And of course, some people say it still goes on today, unofficially. Now, let's look at African American leaders seeking reform during this time, too. Reconstruction ended in failure, but there were a few opportunities and a few leaders who were calling for more rights for African Americans. There were many African American groups. They created clubs, they wrote newspapers, they created political organizations to protect and further their rights in a variety of ways. One example of this is a man named Booker T. Washington. So I mentioned before that these new historically black colleges and universities were being built during this time. Booker T. Washington was one of the people making these colleges. He was probably the most famous African American leader of the late 1800s. Booker T. Washington had been born into slavery. After the Civil War, he called for African Americans not to fight segregation, not to rise up against it, but instead basically to prove that segregation was unnecessary, to prove that they were equal to whites by becoming hardworking, good members of society. He founded a HBCU called the Tuskegee Institute in order to teach African Americans job skills. And he thought that the best way to kind of advance was to advance economically, but keep your head down the whole time. So here's Booker T. Washington, 1856 to 1915, born in Virginia, where he eventually he became an educator. He was also the co-founder of the National Negro Business League, trying to sort of get these different African American owned businesses to sort of work together and support each other. He created the Tuskegee Institute in 1881, and he believed that spreading African American education and entrepreneurship was the best way of fighting Jim Crow. He once said there are two ways of exerting one's strength. One is pushing down, the other is pulling up. In contrast to Booker T. Washington was W.E.B. Du Bois. We started with a quote from him. Du Bois was another prominent African-American leader and scholar. He was younger than Washington. He was born after the Civil War, and he was born free into a Massachusetts family. He also got his Ph.D. from Harvard in 1896. Du Bois did not believe in Booker T. Washington's method of sort of the slow and steady wins the race version of getting rid of segregation. Du Bois didn't believe that they had to prove anything to anyone. He demanded immediate equality and criticized Washington as sort of playing into the hands of white Southerners. So here is W.E.B. Du Bois, 1868 to 1963, from Massachusetts. He is also one of the co-founders of the Niagara Movement and the NAACP. We will get to both of those groups during the Progressive Era. He went to Fisk, which was an HBCU, before heading to Harvard. He also believed in creating a united Africa. He was what we call a Pan-Africanist. He wanted to also get rid of any European colonization in Africa, and at the end of his life, he actually went to Africa to look into this, passing away in Ghana in West Africa. Du Bois once said, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line." Lastly, we have Ida B. Wells. She was a female African-American leader of the time. Ida B. Wells was born into slavery in 1862, very late into, slavery was about to be over. She grew up in Mississippi. She became a school teacher. She later became a newspaper editor. And defended the rights of African Americans prominently. She spoke up against lynching in the South, which was, I think, in the end, I heard a statistic once. I think it was that an African American was lynched in the South every 3 days or something like that. And so she wrote articles against this, and this got her a lot of flack in the South. So here is Ida B. Wells, 1862 to 1931. Born in Mississippi, she was an author, a journalist, an activist, a women's rights activist, and an anti-lynching advocate. Her father was a trustee for the HBCU Rust College, and she went there, and then she went to the other HBCU of Fisk University. Eventually, she had to get out of the Deep South, and she settled in Chicago after her anti-lynching articles got her more notoriety than she was hoping for. Also, for a long time in the south side of Chicago, there were housing projects called the Ida B. Wells Housing Projects. She also helped to organize a boycott of the Chicago World's Fair in 1892 because it had a lack of African American representation. So we do see that there are leaders that are growing out of this Reconstruction time period. I.W. Wells once said, "I'd rather go down in history as the one lone Negro who dared to tell the government that it had done a dastardly thing than to save my skin by taking back what I said." Basically, she said, "I refuse to apologize." Now, like I said, most historians view this time period of Reconstruction as it started out with great expectations, but it ended up being the lowest of low points for African American rights in this country. And this was especially because there was a possibility of success at the beginning, and therefore the tragedy of its failure was even harsher. And finally, in the end, it proved to be a giant missed opportunity, and the legacy would be felt for decades, all the way up through today.